recording. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Sustainable Design Masterclass. We're committed to bringing you some of the top regenerative system designers, ecologists, and entrepreneurs who are actually making the world better for ecology, economy, and people's lives. So we are super stoked to bring back Erik Ohlsen. And as always, we thank you. Thank you for joining us. This is our 43rd webinar, I believe. That is great. We didn't know that when we started this 2 years ago that we would get this much response, so that would keep going. But before we start, again, if you're new, turn off your distractions, leave your Facebook off, your Instagrams, turn them all off, because Erik is going to share some incredible information about wildfire that might, especially if you live in a forest area, might really save your life. So I hope you give it your full attention, because I am super stoked to bring him here and to learn as much as possible. And one more time, I'm Raleigh Latham, joined by co-founder of Sustainable Design Masterclass, Neil Spackman, and we got Erik Ohlsen of Permaculture, Artisans, and what was you wrote group in Sebastopol?
He's of like 5 different things.
Yeah. Neil, okay, yeah. Moving on. Neil, how about you?
Yeah. Erik Ohlsen of Permaculture Skills Center and the Eco Landscape Mastery Course, and Activate Your Joy author, and author of a number of kids' books as well, right? Are you up to 3 kids' books or 2? Or more?
I've got three kids' books. I've got 2 coloring books, ecosystem farming coloring books.
Yeah.
And then the self-help book.
There you go.
Yeah.
All right. I feel like we just did this because we had Erik on 2 weeks ago, and we did a fantastic webinar. And then that webinar was delayed because of fires sweeping across California that caused an immense amount of destruction in a very short amount of time. And Erik, I know you've been doing a lot of work in response to these fires, but there's also a lot of stuff of if things were managed differently, maybe a different result would have occurred, right? And so we're talking specifically about where you are. It's a Mediterranean climate, kind of a Mediterranean forest thing, and there are a lot of dryland forests with a very similar kind of climate. And so this isn't just relevant to California, this is relevant to a lot of different places, especially if you're interested in agroforestry and its management in places where burning is a traditional management system. And so Erik produces a lot of stuff. He's in a lot of different circles, and he's got his thumb in a lot of different pots. And we're really happy to have you on again, Erik, to talk about this specific topic, which is so relevant. And the underlying principles here are so fundamental in how land and water is managed currently to how it should be managed. So with that intro, take it away, Erik. This is your stage now.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Raleigh and Neil, for having me back here and organizing this. Is very timely to have this conversation, being that we've just we're in the recovery phase of these devastating fires here in Sonoma County, and over 200,000 acres have burned in the last month, and so we're in the recovery phase of that, which is arduous. It's challenging. We had heavy rain last night, which is causing a whole series of secondary disasters, which I'll talk about in a few, and one of the frames that we've noticed is, when we live in fire ecologies, most people in this modern day, fast-paced human culture, a culture that's disconnected from the natural environment largely, we don't think the fire's ever going to come to us. It's not in the back of our mind that there could be a wildfire this year as we go about our daily business, and then fire disrupts it all. So so today, hold on here, let's see. Let me just figure out my here we go. Okay, Sorry about that. All right, so getting into today's agenda, we're going to get clear on what is a fire ecology, and we're going to talk about the regenerative side of fire and the destructive side of fire, regenerative disturbances in general. So we'll get into a bit about management and what is a regenerative disturbance and why is that such an important part of ecosystem management. We'll talk about relationship to ecology and then growing from the ashes, as this community is doing right now. So first off, what is a fire ecology? It's an ecosystem that has co-evolved with fire over thousands and thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. And a large part of planet Earth is a fire ecology, not just California, not just the Mediterranean. The boreal forest is a fire ecology. There's huge swaths of our environments on the planet have co-evolved with fire, and fire plays very powerful roles in the environment. And when we say fire ecology, when we say it's co-evolved, we actually are talking about the plants and animals, the ecology, the soil, the climate, all the aspects that make an environment what it is, in its nuance, in its detail, in its diversity, actually needs fire periodically in order to provide a whole set of functions. Because fire isn't just about disaster and catastrophe. It is actually doing a set of functions. It's managing vegetation, it's alkalinizing soil, it's providing mineral distribution. There's a whole set of functions that fire actually plays in the environment that is necessary because these ecosystems have evolved for so many years with that. And many of the plant communities in fire ecologies actually depend on fire. And I have some, well, actually I'll tell you a story here in just a second. This is a picture of a yerba santa right in the Mayacamas that just burned. This picture was just taken this week on Monday. And you can see that just a few weeks after the fire, we already have the yerba santa sprouting from its root base. The whole top is burned off, and here it is sprouting with vigor. There's no competition now with all the annuals and invasive plants. They're gone. Now yerba santa has its chance to push out and dominate this area. Not to mention, I found a big stand of this yerba santa that the seeds need fire to increase their viability. And there's seeds all over the ground in these ecosystems. And many of the wildland areas right now that were burned are completely covered in native seed. It's almost as if we went out there and broadcast seed, like when I broadcast seed on my farm or in my gardens for my landscape clients, and the whole surface of the soil is covered in a coat of seeds. Well, that is essentially what all the wildlands look like right now after these fires. It's kind of mind-blowing and incredible. And the other night we had a great meeting and got to learn from this native man, Edward Willie. He's an indigenous man to this area, Pomo and Miwok and Wailaki, and he told us a story, and I just want to share a little bit about that story. I wish we had Edward here to tell it himself, and hopefully I'll have a chance to bring him into a future conversation. So this is pretty mind-blowing, which is why I've included it here. So the fire zone that we are calling the Tubbs fire, which is the most destructive fire that happened. And there's multiple fires here that happened in the last month. The most destructive one was this Tubbs fire that moved incredibly fast, about 4 miles per hour it moved. And the ember storm was spreading the fire quickly across the mountains, and then it blew out of the mountains. It crossed a huge highway, Highway 101, and blew into northern Santa Rosa. And that area of northern Santa Rosa is the northernmost part of the Laguna de Santa Rosa. So we're talking about some topographical elements here. We've got coastal hills where the fire blew through, and then we have this big wetland area which is really flat, dry at this time of year, and the fire blew onto that part of northern Santa Rosa onto that flatland. And many folks are like, wow, how could this happen? This is crazy. How did the fire cross Highway 101? How did it blow into these neighborhoods? Like, we thought fires were supposed to be contained to the forested hills, and here we are in urban environment, a city, and the fire has blown into the city where there's not a lot of trees and not a lot of fuel load other than houses, which is the greatest fuel load of all. So how did this happen? Is it a special event? Is it something that it has only happened this one time? So as we look back into history, we see that, oh, 50-some years ago, the same fire happened. Didn't blow all the way into Santa Rosa the way this one did, but pretty much burned the same exact footprint. So now we see, okay, so there's a pattern here. We're living in this fire ecology, and these fires in this one particular area is happening at around a 50-year interval. We'll now enter the indigenous wisdom. Because in talking with Edward, he said, well, actually, the Pomo have been tracking these fires for 10,000 years. 10,000 years, all right? So, you know, if that doesn't expand your mind to what it is to be in a fire ecology. There's nothing we are going to do to keep fire from happening. It's all about our relationship to it. We can mitigate the level of destruction, but we need to understand that we are going to be living with fires generationally. But what the Pomo did is they actually placed a very special plant to them, and that's this picture right here. This is dogbane, a very special plant right in that area of northern Santa Rosa where the fire blows out of the mountain and onto the flat land. They had up to a 5 square mile area of dogbane that requires fire for its health, its longevity. And dogbane is a very, very important plant to the native people because they make all their cordage out of it. And Edward was saying it would take 60,000 strands of dogbane to make one family's fishing net. So they would make fishing nets and use it every day for hunting and for other utilitarian uses. And that when the fire blows into the dogbane patch, it activates something in the dogbane so it grows up really long and straight. So they get those really nice long strands. So Edward is managing what's left of his ancestors' dogbane patch, and there's about, he says, maybe about 2 acres left of, because, you know, encroached in development and stuff. And this 2 acres, I guess, is in a protected area now. So he's been managing it. And so he's been, over the last years, you know, visiting the patch, and it's been getting clogged out by blackberries and annual grasses and was really getting choked out. The fires have come through. And his report, checking in with the dogbane patch, is that all the blackberries are gone, all the annual invasives are gone. Trees have been burned to nothing, and the dogbane still has green on it. The leaves were burned off and the stalks are still there, totally alive, totally green. So talk about working within nature. Talk about understanding the role of fire in the environment and building a deep relationship with fire, right? To the degree that the indigenous people of these lands were dependent on the dogbane in order for hunting and for other uses, and that dogbane was dependent on fire. So that's what it is to live in a fire ecology at its in its most foundational way, that we need to build this relationship back up. And now we're in a totally different situation. Now we've built into that wildland-urban interface. We have all this development. We're not taking care of soil. We're not taking care of native plants. But as this fire has awakened so much of the community to its destruction, my hope is here today when we talk about it, and as part of our recovery and part of the education that I'm doing among many others, that we understand the role of fire and build a better relationship with it moving forward. So let's talk about the different kinds of fire, because there are those regenerative fires and there are those destructive fires. And I think that what we need to do is we need to talk a bit about the difference between what would be a regenerative fire and what would be a destructive fire. So first off, a regenerative or cleansing fire is much cooler. Okay, the heat intensity is much less. It's I mean, the fire that hit the Tubbs fire, the one that recently happened, got up into over 1,000 degrees, right? That's very intense heat, and that's going to incinerate everything in its path. But those were only in certain spots that the fire got so hot. Around the edges, the fire was much cooler. And in many of the burn areas that I've been walking, there has been some cleansing effects to the fire, as I showed you with that yerba santa. So a regenerative fire is a cooler fire. It doesn't get up into the crown of the trees. It's really an understory, underbrush fire that just cleans out that understory, that thatch layer, that leaf litter, and doesn't get up into the top of the trees and decimate the forest in total. And part of that cleansing is it can actually remove disease as time goes on and there's no fire and there's no management and the forest gets all congested and clogged. We have all kinds of diseases and issues. The trees are stressed out essentially due to their congestion and all of the secondary factors that happen from that. So fire comes in and actually can remove some of that disease. Fire actually is a mineral cycling system, and it helps with mineral nutrient cycling, and it also helps alkalinize, which here in California, for the most part, our soils are very acidic, which provides challenges for plant growth and agriculture and immune system functioning of the forest. And so as a cleansing fire moves through, it actually helps to balance out that pH. So another great benefit to fire. And then it activates seeds. It literally activates seeds. Many seeds, conifer seeds and herbaceous plants, they need fire in order to be viable. So they need that heat, otherwise they're not going to sprout. So what we will likely see in this springtime is a resurgence of native seeds, native wildflowers, native plants that have now had their chance, now that they've had the scarification of fire. So this is some of what this cleansing fire, and also it removes all those invasives, like we were talking about the story with the dog bane, removed all those invasives that were choking out this important plant, and now that plant has a chance to really thrive. So there are actually a lot of benefits to these cleansing fires. It's hard to talk about. I have to be, honest with you all. It's really hard to talk about all these benefits of fires within the grief of the destruction that we've just experienced. I mean, people have lost their lives, lost their homes, lost their livelihoods. The situation has not gone away. So I got to honor my grief and the grief of what we're all going through in the recovery process. And part of that honoring is to sort of honor the role of fire in its positive light too, so that we don't just think of fire as the enemy, because right now it's pretty easy to think of it as the enemy because of all the destruction that so many of us have experienced, but it's not. And in fact, it's this disconnection, the disconnection with fire, that has resulted in the level of destruction that we now have. So a destructive fire burns really, really hot. And when you get that kind of heat, because it's fed by, it has that fuel load feeding it, it creates its own winds. It has, this particular fire, the conditions were that we had what we call the Diablo winds. So they're offshore winds coming from inland, blowing to the east. Those are the fire winds. And they feed this kind of fire so hot that it pretty much incinerates everything in its path when it gets to that kind of heat. And so one of the problems that we face is that as humans, we've developed in the wildland, right? There's this wildland-urban interface that not just here in Sonoma County, all over the world, we've developed into these fire ecology zones right up into the forest. And those edges are very, very dangerous for human development. And we've seen the results with the Fountain Grove development and Coffee Park here that have been burned to the ground as part of this being in the path of fire, because planners and developers, and I don't want to get into all the politics of how all that came about, decided that it was okay to build there without considering the history. And of course, when we say the history, often modern day humans are only looking, maybe a few decades, maybe 100 years, but in truth, we need to be talking to the indigenous people. Because imagine if the indigenous people of these lands had a voice when planners were talking about building Fountain Grove, and you could say, hey, this isn't just a couple fires over the last 100 years, 10,000 years. we've been watching fires come through here. I mean, imagine with that kind of knowledge and that kind of connection, how we could understand better how to develop and build in these fire zones. So, and then of course, as the fires do blow out of the wildlands into the urban zone, houses, the way we build our houses, the roofing material that we use, the way that we manage our landscapes around the buildings are all just ready to light up like that. We're not really incorporating much fire-resistant building currently, and it doesn't look like a lot of the new developments are necessarily going to be incorporating that. I mean, one of the easiest things we could do in this wildland-urban interface is stop using composite shingles. Don't use cedar shakes. We should really be using metal roofs or tile roofing, because what happens is the ember storm that is the front of the fire actually blows embers onto the roofs of the house. That's most of the way that they ignite. And if our roofing material is not fire resistant, this will just go right up. So that's actually kind of an easy, relatively easy developmental thing that we could do, is just say, hey, let's only do metal roofs or tile roofs or some kind of fire resistant roofing to protect against an ember storm like the one that we saw. And then what a hot fire does is it creates catastrophic destruction. There's nothing healing about this. This is the Coffee Park, and it's, I feel emotional when I see this. Friends live here, friends of friends, family of friends live here, and this is what it is to not understand the role of fire. This is what it is to build in the fire zone without considering exactly what we're doing, without looking into that deep historical knowledge about how we build, where we build, and why. This can be the result. And of course, nobody thinks it's going to happen to them, right? So here we are in the recovery zone. But how many of you listening to this right now are living in a fire ecology and you haven't experienced fire yet? And you might be sitting cozy in your house, surrounded by woodland, wonderful, and you think, well, it's never going to happen to me, right? And that's what we all think all the time. But the truth is, these fires, 10,000 years of history tells us this fire is going to happen again. And so, so these are some questions that I'm posing, is that you have to prepare yourself. You have to prepare yourself. There's no, it's not going to happen to me. If it doesn't happen to you, it's going to happen to the next person inhabiting that dwelling or that community. And so what can we do in our building, in our management, in our relationship to these areas to avoid this kind of catastrophic destruction? I think this level of destruction could have been avoided with better planning, better development, and better management. We could have avoided this level of catastrophe. We're never going to stop the fire, but we could avoid this level of catastrophe. And then there's a whole bunch of other things that happen with these hot fires. One is the hazardous smoke, and if you're in the Bay Area during the couple weeks of the fire, it's not as if the hazardous smoke is just local to where the fire is. It's blowing miles and miles and miles and miles away, and it's a real issue. We were inside for a week straight with all the windows and doors shut, wearing masks anytime we go outside. And we would take trips out to the coast, which was the only fresh air, just to get the kids outside and breathe a little fresh air for a couple hours. So that's another aspect of these fires. And then now we're dealing with something that is the secondary disaster, and that is the toxic ash. That picture I showed you before of the burnt down Coffee Park neighborhood, well, just think about for a second. You're in your house. What's in your house? Look around. Do you have a washing machine in your house, an oven? Do you have electrical? What's your plumbing made out of? Do you have PVC pipe in your house? Do you have lighting fixtures, and what kind of paint do you have? And as you start to, are there plastics in your house? TVs, computers? As you start to think about what's in your house and what those things are actually made of, which are heavy metals and dioxins and all kinds of toxins and all that stuff. Now imagine that when it burns, it condenses all those toxins into the ash. And this is the big disaster that we're trying to mitigate right now. We had heavy rains last night, and the potential for that ash, which has any number of different things, from all different kinds of heavy metals, dioxins, hydrocarbons, PCBs, any number of different toxins are in there, can wash into our creeks now, wash into our rivers, wash into our waterways, wash into our water systems, right? Where hundreds of thousands of people actually get their water from. So this is what we're dealing with right now. Like, I'm here giving this presentation, and there's dozens and dozens of people out placing wattles and trying to protect our waterways right now as we speak. So this is some of the catastrophic result of not being in relationship to fire, of not developing and planning and managing in a way that we can avoid this sort of catastrophe. So I know that's some intense stuff, and I'm sorry to bring the grief side of this in here, but let's go into what we can do now. Okay, like, we know what the disaster that's possible and what we want to avoid, but what can we do? And when we think about fire, we want to think about it in the frame of a regenerative disturbance, because a healthy wildfire, which is going to happen in these fire ecologies, provides all those benefits like I had already mentioned. But there's other kinds of regenerative disturbances that can actually help mitigate the level of catastrophic fire, that help manage vegetation, and large animals are part of that. Large animals like the bear, actually I meant to have a picture of the California flag here, I forgot to put that in. So on the California flag, there's a grizzly bear, right? That's like the state animal. There's no grizzly bears in California anymore. So let's just think for a moment that at one point California was full of grizzly bears. And here in Sonoma County, right where I am, right where these fires were, there were bear here for thousands and thousands of years. Okay, there's no bear here now. This is a brown bear. There's no bear here now. There's bear in the Sierra Nevadas, and there's like a few bear around, but not that many. But what is this role that bear play? Well, bear are amazing is that they go into the understory of the forest, and they're breaking down material. They're eating grubs, they're eating mushrooms, and if you look at the activity of the bear, they are helping manage all that fuel load in the forest. Because let's talk about fuel load just for a moment. The fire hits, right? Like 50 years ago, the Henley fire hit, where the Tubbs fire is now, and it burned a lot down. Then afterwards, all of this growth happened rapidly. All the trees grew back and seeds activated, and they all grew really, really rapidly. But without any management, they get really, really congested. So there's not a lot of space in between the trees, and some trees end up dying in the understory. They end up having a lot of low branches and stuff, and those are all what we call fuel load that would, if a fire came with all that fuel load in the system, it would immediately go up and become a crown fire. And then a crown fire is these catastrophic fires that create these ember storms and spread so quickly. So, but what bear do is they get in and they break down a lot of those lower branches, they smash them into the ground, and they provide a management function. So that's one of our management tools that is no longer here in our ecosystem. It's the bear are not here doing that. And private property and fencing and roads, and there's all kinds of human development that are keeping bear from being able to come back and colonize these areas. And there are other kinds of regenerative disturbances as well, like floods. So I want to talk about floods for a minute, because I live in a fire ecology, but others might live in a hurricane zone or a flood zone, or another area where extreme events might happen. I mean, frost can be an extreme event, drought can be an extreme event. And the thing about these extreme events is, and now I think they're totally exacerbated by climate change, and that's pretty much undisputable. But even without the extra extreme aspect of climate change, just table that for a second. You still have historically these extreme events that happen, but they provide a role just like fire does. They cleanse the system, right? They remove a lot of debris. They provide a kind of reset. It's like an extreme event like this is sort of like hitting the reset button, right? Like you have to reboot your computer because it freezes up. right? And it's stagnant. So you have to shut everything down and you reboot your computer to get it functioning again. Well, that's essentially what happens in nature, is that without these management tools, without these extreme events, it just gets kind of stagnant. And at some point, it has to hit the reset button, whether it's fire or flood or hurricane. Now, of course, the level of intensity that we're experiencing now on planet Earth is very intense and more destructive than regenerative, but we still want to understand the role that these extreme events play as disturbances in our environment. So being that we now have moved into the wildland-urban interface, being that we now have developed into flood zones, being that we have sprawled our our human communities in the way we have, and we've removed a lot of the management folk, like the bear and fire, from the environment, we need human-led management. And one of the things that we can do in the forest is we can mimic the bear. We can mimic the bear by going into these congested forests and trimming off all those fire ladders and removing the dead wood and allowing that material to turn back into soil, getting it back into contact with the ground, chipping it, or whatever's appropriate to each area, because each area is totally different. And as part of that, we can be playing that role of the bear, playing that role of fire, to help manage and mitigate the level of destruction that we've been seeing. And we can use fire as a tool. And Indigenous people have been using fire as a tool for millennia, thousands and thousands of years. They've been using fire as a way to provide that cleansing fire. And often a prescribed fire or a controlled burn is done at a particular time of year where the vegetation is still is green. It's not at a time of year where it can travel up into the ground or it's fed by those hot inland winds or anything like that. So there's a specific timing to do these prescribed fires. And we haven't made a lot of gains in Sonoma County and some of the more urban wildland interfaces to getting the approval to bring fire back in as a management tool. But because of these fires, and we just had a fire ecologist on a panel the other night who does prescribed burns, and she was talking about that now they're open to the conversation, and it looks like, and this is really to be celebrated, it looks like there will be a program in the next couple years where folks can learn how to create prescribed fire in Sonoma County and Napa and Lake County in this region and bring fire back to these ecologies, bring fire back to these environments in a beneficial way, in a healthy way that don't provide all that catastrophe. And by doing that, these prescribed fires will burn a lot of that fuel load out of the forest at the right time of year without creating catastrophe, without creating the disaster, so that when 50 years from now, when the fire comes over the hill again, it won't have the force and the power and the fuel to be so intensely destructive. It will be more of a healing fire even then. And as part of our management and human-led disturbances, we can be creating shaded fuel breaks. So prescribed fire can help us with that, but essentially what a shaded fuel break is it's going into these forested areas, it's identifying a zone. I like to use the principles of permaculture when I design a shaded fuel break, so often it will be where I want a pathway or a road or maybe some kind of water conveyance system. So is there an area that provides a multitude of different functions where you're actually, you're removing trees, right? It's a beneficial thinning of an area in the forest, but not in a clear-cut way, not in a way where we're clearing all the trees out, but we're actually thinning the forest and creating a fire break. But the reason why it's a shaded fuel break is because the canopies of the adjacent trees can still shade this this fire break. And so what's cool about that is you don't create like a big scar on the land. And again, if you use a holistic design frame, you can design these shaded fuel breaks to provide a whole host of functions, whether it be access or water conveyance or agriculture or what have you, and get all that extra added benefit out of it. So there's a lot of great foresters and arborists and land stewards around who can actually build these shaded fuel breaks, but one of the big challenges that we face is that landowners generally either don't have the funds or don't want to prioritize their funding, the money that they have to pay people to do this kind of work. I shared this story with a lot of folks over the last few weeks. I actually had some clients whose properties are burned to the ground now, that just a couple of years ago we consulted on their properties. One was 1,000 acres, and I noticed just how much fuel load there was in that forest and how congested it was, and it actually kind of terrified me, because I thought, if a fire comes through here, this whole place is going down. And it's right at kind of where the fire activated, where this land is. And so I had given the client a proposal. I think it was, maybe about $100,000 of fuel load reduction over many, many, many acres, building shaded fuel breaks, stacking in water harvesting systems into those fuel breaks, and access ways, and a whole management plan for their forested lands. And they didn't want to do it. They didn't want to prioritize their funds. It's not that they didn't have the money. They wanted to build another house. They wanted to do more with more development instead. So there's a prioritization issue that we have with development and management. And and that being said, that's a lot to invest for forest management, just for the sake of reducing the catastrophic event of a fire. And so we need to come up with some incentives. I don't have all the solutions right now. I was at a great meeting last night where we were talking about different ways to maybe incentivize and maybe funding mechanisms through resource conservation districts that could maybe help landowners manage their forest and their fuel load in a way that could prevent the kind of catastrophe that we've seen. But it's definitely an issue. And as ecological designers, I know many people who come in here onto the Sustainable Masterclass, your regenerative agriculturists and your ecological designers and permaculturists. This is in the realm of what you can provide for your clientele. This is what my company, Permaculture Artisans, whenever we go into a forested zone, these are some of the services that we provide: is forest stewardship, fuel load management and reduction, and we work with arborists and foresters and other professionals to help provide some of that. So, so when we think about being ecological designers and land stewards, we don't want to silo ourselves just into edibles and just into agriculture or just into landscaping. When we look bigger into the larger management of our ecologies, there's a lot of space that we can step into to help provide this kind of support for landowners. So fuel load reduction, just as I said, getting in there, thinning those dead and dying trees, thinning those branches, turning them into compost, wood chipping them. Some people will put them into burn piles and burn them off. That's okay. As much as possible, I like to try to get all the biomass into the ground, because we have a carbon deficit in the soil and we have too much carbon in the atmosphere. So the more we can get that biomass onto the ground, the better. That could be a bit more expensive, so we have to kind of we've got to work our edges there about what's appropriate. And then grazing. So here's a picture of elk, and here's a little bit more story, that just as we lost the bear from as being an ecological manager of our forest, we've also lost the elk. And that big flat area that I was telling you about that the fire blew in northern Santa Rosa with the big dogbane patch, that whole area of the Laguna de Santa Rosa used to be home to elk, and they would move in herds of even 1,000 at a time, and they would go up into the hillsides at times of the year too and manage all the meadows and all the grasslands. Now, just them eating grass and stomping all the dead aerial matter into the ground so it has contact with soil, they would remove all the thatch layers, which is another fuel that feeds fire. Now, grazing isn't going to stop the fire, but it's going to cool the fire down, it's going to slow it down and reduce that level of catastrophe, that level of severity. So, so it's an important management tool, just like becoming the bear and going out into the forest and doing that fuel load reduction, just like returning fire to these ecosystems in a controlled, prescribed way so that they can be beneficial, and providing these shaded fuel breaks. These are all things that we can do immediately as managers of our ecosystems. And since we're not bringing the elk back just yet, we can incorporate grazing animals and grazing systems in place of the elk. And actually, a lot of ranches around here did burn, and the areas that did have good grazing, while they burned, the fire, again, it moved slower, it was cooler, and it was a lot less destructive. So just to put it in the frame again, that we're talking about regenerative disturbances. We're talking about disturbances in the landscape, in the environment, in the ecology that provide management tools to the environment that keep it in balance, that reduce the potential for catastrophic events, and that we as humans now, since we've removed, since we've taken the land from indigenous people who have managed the lands for thousands of years, since we've removed many of the large animals and taken fire out of the equation, it's really up to us now to show up and provide the management that the land needs to be healthy, to be regenerative, and to protect against catastrophe. So this is all about our relationship to ecology. And part of that is to understand that every site is totally different. Even the different areas where the fire hit here in Sonoma and Napa County and Lake County and Mendocino County, there's fires in all those counties in the last month. That every one of those fires was a little bit different, and each one of these environments are a little bit different. So one thing that I want to say is that we can't take one solution and then apply it across the board to every environment. And this is where we need to learn how to be really good ecological designers, really good at reading the landscape, at learning the story of place. The more that we can understand the story of our context, the specific land that we're on, the specific ridge, the specific valley, the orientation of the slope, the microclimate that we live in. There are so many variables that change how a fire event or a flood event or some sort of extreme event would occur and how it would function and act in that area. So we need to become really good at reading landscape and reading environment. And as we develop that kind of intelligence, like we are here at the Sustainable Masterclass and like we do in my Ecological Landscape Mastery School, as we gain those skills and learn how to read the land, then we can use our management tools, whether it's grazing, whether it's chainsaw, whether it's fire, whether it's agriculture or it's water, whatever our tools are, we can use them appropriately to the context that we live in. And then so that's that kind of support and providing that right management. You know, once we understand our context, then we can actually manage these. And then the other piece is we need to always be prepared now. Whatever it is for you and your ecosystem, maybe you're not in a fire ecology, but you're in a hurricane zone, or you're in a flood zone, whatever the catastrophe is, like flash floods in the desert, like that's an extreme event in the desert that folks need to be prepared for, right? So whatever it is, be prepared. It's easy to get complacent and relaxed and cozy and comfy and think, oh, it's never going to happen to me. It's never going to happen here. But when it does, you know, in hindsight, you'll feel like if you were ill prepared. You don't want to experience that. You just don't. So as we understand our context and we build a relationship to our ecology, then we prioritize preparedness, not because out of fear, out of respect. All right? Be prepared because you respect the environment that you live in, not just because you're afraid. And so you can protect yourself and your family and your community and your investments so that you don't experience the kind of destruction that we see here. This is the Tubbs Fire area, and I wanted to point out a couple things. There's a few slopes here that have absolutely zero life on them. There's not even any branches, and there's nothing left of the trees at all. And that's because the fire burned so hot that it just incinerated everything. And if we were able to manage these lands differently, if we were able to respect fire's role in the ecology and we lived in relationship here, we might have been able to mitigate this level of destruction. Because in the end, we want to remember that we're nature, that humans play a role in the environment. And until we get that we play a role, not just a destructive role, it's not, you know, we're not just the problem, we are actually the solution. So when we remember that we are the solution to managing and stewarding our environments and our ecologies, then that relationship, we have all the tools, not just the modern day tools, but our hands, our feet, our eyes, our ability to read landscapes, to listen, to see, to feel, to breathe. These are all tools that we're born with. Inherently, as beings of nature, of the planet, if we can see ourselves as part of these ecosystems, as managers, as stewards, then we can avoid catastrophe. And we can mimic those natural patterns. We can mimic the bear, we can mimic the elk, we can mimic the fire in our stewardship and management activities. Because essentially, we need to take responsibility. We're here now. We live in these environments, and we're not going away. Even if sometimes you hear like that kind of environmentalist view of like, well, humans just have to go away. Just like if humans were gone, then the earth would be good, it would be healthy again, and all these things. Well, it might be true that humans are very destructive, and it is true, but we're also the solution. And it's our responsibility to steward and manage these environments. So there's a mind frame thing here. It's not just about technique. It's not just about strategy. It's actually about how we see ourselves in our environments. Do we see ourselves as part of them or separate from them? And it's that mind frame that's going to be the difference between catastrophe in the future or not. So now the fire is hit. In this area, the fire is hit, and we're in the process of really growing up through the ashes. So there's a process in that, and the first thing is safety. What happens when the fire hits? What happens now to mitigate the secondary disasters? And it's really about safety first. This is an evacuation map of during the fires. A bunch of my family was inside these evacuation zones and evacuated to my house. Lots of friends lost their homes in these areas. So safety first. Obviously, human life is kind of the first thing. And then right now, if you all who are here in the webinar, or people who have experienced these fires, or folks who have experienced some of the other fires in Portugal, in Spain, and other parts of the world, it's a pretty grief-stricken event. So there's an emotional side to giving space for people to grieve and understanding that people are going to have a whole set of different emotions, and it's been pretty intense. I mean, we're basically living in a whole community that's totally traumatized right now, and it hasn't gone away, and people deal with it differently. And so, be kind to each other. We want to be kind to each other. We want to be open to each other. My whole family, we all felt it. We're all still feeling it. And so, it's important to see the emotional side of this too, so that we can stay together. And then we can actually rise from the ashes. And that's one of the lessons of these fires that I think has been one of the most profound, which is how the community has come together. It's unbelievable how people have come together to help each other and support each other, giving housing and shelter and resources and support, physical support and food and love, and coming together to revision what it's like to live in these areas, to heal the landscapes, to really recover from these fires. Sonoma County Rises is a new organization group, community-led, that's happening now to really create a space for people to have a voice in the process of the rebuild and the recovery. So these events can bring people together. Not that we want to have destruction to bring people together. So how about we rise in our communities before the destruction arrives? How about we get together and plan and strategize and support each other so that we can avoid having the destruction? And then as what we're currently in right now is we're trying to mitigate the secondary disaster. So we've had the fire, but now we have all of this toxic ash, and it is running off into all of our waterways and into our water systems. So this is a picture just taken yesterday. You can see the big culvert on the right-hand side there that is really draining a lot of the area of Coffee Park, where the biggest development that got burned down. So a lot of toxic ash is going to get washed through here. So these are a bunch of straw wattles that have been placed, and will all be inoculated with mycelium. So there's this really amazing thing happening right now in Sonoma County that is pretty unprecedented, which is that we have all kinds of groups. We've got the Water Board and the City of Santa Rosa and the RCDs and nonprofit organizations and the Board of Supervisors and all kinds of different official organizations and grassroots organizations that are all working together to not only recover from all, the fire and everything, but actually to implement cutting-edge ecological remediation strategies. And we just had a meeting with many members of this group, and we're making wattles that will be pre-inoculated with mycelium. We are getting substrate from cat trying to jump on me. We're getting spent mushroom substrate from a local business, Gourmet Mushrooms, are providing a lot of this material, and we're getting them into these waterways. And this whole citizen science opportunity is upon us now, where we can actually test and deploy strategies to remediate, and then test again and monitor. And we are slowly moving to creating a prescriptive fire response strategy for remediation after fire, using cutting-edge ecological techniques like micro-remediation, biological remediation, within the context of the urgency and all the things that are going on. So it's pretty unprecedented and incredible. The challenge that we face is because it's so urgent right now to get wattles out to keep the toxic ash from flowing into the waterways. Things are moving very, very, very fast. A scientific approach doesn't generally move very fast, so we're working out how to get the testing regimes in there. We're working out how to create controls and really target specific different toxins so that we use the right kind of mushroom or the right strategy to bioremediate a particular kind of toxin from entering the waterways. So stay in tune, stay in touch with how this all unfolds, because incredible things are coming out of all of this. I also just heard recently that as they're cutting all of the trees that burned like along the roadways, there's all these trees along roadways, they could fall into the road, so they're being cut and chipped, and there are thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of yards of wood chips now being created, and there's nowhere to put them supposedly, and they're potentially going to get hauled out of the county. So we were talking last night about, well, how can we redirect all of this biomass and use it for erosion control, for carbon sinking, for bioremediation and such. So there's all of these secondary things that are happening after the fire, and as it would after a hurricane or a flood or anything, there's all of these secondary potential disasters that we want to be planning for and ready to respond to. And then there's these opportunities for the ecological solutions to have their place in all of this work. So we are now at the place where we're rebuilding for regeneration, and this is a bunch grass in the burn zone that has already sprouted in the last couple weeks. These grasses have co-evolved with fire, so they've put their roots deep down, and now they're able to draw on that energy to grow up and hold that soil together. So how can we as communities that live in fire ecologies or live in any area of extreme event, how can we root down into the land in a way that we can regenerate and rebuild from these catastrophes and these disasters? I want to take my cue from this amazing bunch grass as to how we respond in these situations. And then, so far the response has been absolutely amazing, and I just have to put the shout out to everybody who's risked their lives and worked tirelessly, without sleep, without resources, for days and days and days on end to protect all of us and help us get through this disaster. And I think we are ready to get into questions. That's the end of my presentation, so let's bring it on back.
Man, that was excellent, Eric. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I know that it's been a trippy last month, just a bizarre, scary last month. Like driving down from the Convergence, Yeah, I didn't know that the exact same night that these fires were getting started, and I wake up and there's ash everywhere. And I'm like, what do I do? I got to do something. I got to do something. So I took all my $400 of prepper funds and gathered food, and I went and delivered some food out there. But I mean, it was so good because a lot of these fire shelters had so much supplies that they directed me all the way to Bodega Bay. But even in Santa Cruz, when I was filming a gig, like I saw a wildfire start right before my eyes, and right before, and you can see the smoke. It starts light, and then it starts getting blacker and blacker. And if it wasn't for those giant C-17s dropping, like 12 of them circling, dropping, that probably would have been a mega fire on its own. It's like
Exactly.
This is life-saving wisdom you're sharing. We ignore it at our barrel. So
Yeah.
thank you.
I'm going to just step away real quick, you guys.
Please.
I'll be right back.
Yeah, go for it.
So Erik will return in a moment to answer some questions. Yeah, but in the meantime, before we get these questions about wildfire, Erik has a program going on that's pretty excellent. He's offering something called the Ecological Design Eco Landscape Mastery School. The offer, he's doing ends in 5 days, but it shows you, if you're interested in getting involved in ecological landscaping, how you can go towards a 7-figure ecological landscape in business, and he gives you the step-by-step guides for how he did that with his business. So if you're interested in Erik's work and want to know how he started his landscaping business, the Permaculture Artisans, that link is below in the chat box. And Erik, it's an excellent program. He's really gathered together his decade-plus of experience of starting his landscaping business. That's 7 figures in the permaculture realm. So check it out if that interests you.
We've got a couple comments that are parallels to stuff that I'm seeing. One from Carl and one from Mary.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can comment on this, Raleigh, but how much of the land that's burning is federally managed versus state managed versus county managed? Do you have any idea?
Personally, I don't know the percentages of each of what's burned. Like I'd have to look at a map and then look at a map of the land ownership. But that information is out there. Like you could do an overlay of the sections of who owns what, and then overlay the fire map and see, what's what. But I agree, that's probably a part of it, that federally managed land might not, they might not be doing anything to actually, prescribe burning or clearing brush. You hardly see any of that anywhere.
Right? It's an old pattern where the less local land management is, the worse it tends to be. In my own work, one of the things I'm trying to do is get the equivalent of federally owned land back under local management of the Bedouin that I work with. Because if right now we're looking at 70 years of desertification as an unintended consequence of what was a federal policy. And one of the major obstacles to getting land back to productivity and getting this desert land back into something that's more productive is being able to have people who live there and know the land and are connected with the land manage it. I wouldn't be surprised if it were the case that a lot of this stuff is federal, because it's very hard for large organizations to manage land specifically, right? Especially in a place like the U.S. where bureaucracy is so much rule-based and there's so little flexibility given to the interpretation and implementation of rules. Erik, I don't. You probably just caught the tail end of that, but it's a common pattern that land that is not managed by locals tends to be managed very poorly. And that's something that I've seen here in Saudi Arabia. But it's also something that Montgomery talks about in the book Dirt, about how land that is federally owned or state-owned, and he talks about instances of this in the United States, in Rome, in Carthage, in France, in China, where federal incentives and local incentives are not the same, and they don't have the same priorities. And so land management, the more centralized and the less local it is, the worse it tends to be. Is that something that you're seeing with the land that's burning in California? Is that one of the obstacles here, is a lack of local management?
It's an obstacle in this particular situation, but not because there's federal management in lieu of local management. It's an obstacle because private landowners just aren't managing in these areas. But it's a contextual thing, right? I mean, we have actually the public lands that did burn, they did not burn in the severity that the private lands burned at all. And they're actually, better managed, I would say, a lot of the regional parks and stuff. But I mean, they are local. I mean governmental. The public lands managed by state and regional governments have actually.
Your audio just cut out for 30 seconds.
Luckily, that didn't happen during the presentation. He should be able to. It'll come back in. So sorry, folks. That should fix itself within 10 seconds or so. Eric, we can't hear you. Now you're good, Eric. Can you hear you talk?
Give us a sound test, Eric. Yeah. Can you hear us?
Oh, can you not hear me? I can hear you.
Now we can hear you again. Sorry, I guess
they couldn't of that monologue.
Yeah.
Oh, did you miss what I just said?
So yeah, maybe flip back, rewind, 30 seconds.
You said the local and the state managed stuff perform better than the private and the federal stuff, and then you cut out.
Yes, and then I was saying that's why context is so important, is because there's no one solution for every area, every fire ecology, because land ownership, management strategy, what management tools are in place. Are there? I mean, there's some areas, say in California, where they are doing prescribed fire, and it's very successful. And it's just not happening in this area. So if you live next to a U.S. Forest Service land, that might be a totally different context than what we're in here. So it's just, we have to be very contextual with where we are and figure out what the situation is and then respond accordingly.
Cool. All right, let's get to some questions from our audience. We've got Carolina Park who says, thanks for an amazing presentation. I have a question regarding fire retardants that were dropped to stop the fires and their toxicity to the soil and water. You got any insight into that?
I did see a paper recently that that talked a bit about that, and there's a lot of nitrates in the fire retardant, and so one of the secondary disasters is as the fire retardant washes into our waterways, potentially there's going to be algae blooms and depleted oxygen levels in the waterways. So that's one of the key issues. I did hear something that there might be like a methyl bromine in there as well, but I don't have verification on that. At this point, the toxicity of the burnt structures is a higher priority than anything with the fire retardant. But keeping surface flow that's carrying fire retardant into the waterways is still a key factor in protecting the watershed.
Cool. Question from Roberto, who's coming from Cyprus. He said, the areas that have burned, are they going to reforest? In Cyprus, we had huge wildfires. And it seems that reforestation is going to be a monoculture with no pre-thought as to fire breaks, etc. How do you get the message to the local forestry chaps to work differently?
Yeah, well, in this particular situation, I don't think there's going to be any kind of reforestation effort because the fire only burned hot enough to incinerate all life in particular areas. It's almost like a balding on my head, where you've got singed and partially burned areas, and then you've got these little bald spots. But for the most part, a lot of the forest land is going to grow back, and there's what's that?
It's going to fill in.
It's going to fill in on its own. Yeah, it's at this point what we're saying is don't leave the forest alone, let it do its thing. There's for the most part, most of the root systems are intact and will be sprouting at the stump. I don't know if I had a picture in there. In my walk around the other day, there were some big madrone trees that had burned, and there's already new sprouts coming out of the stump. So really what we want to do is manage what we have and allow that resurgence to happen.
Cool. Here's a quick practical question from Josh. He's saying, is there a recommended height range for fuel ladder clearing?
They say at least 10 feet is the recommendation. Yeah, 10 feet. That's from the firefighters want 10 feet up the tree, which, from an ecological point of view, you've got to be contextual in that. Sometimes, some environmental folks are kind of like, well, there's certain birds that need those lower branches, and there's a whole conversation around habitat along with that. But if you're in the fire zone and you're trying to create defensible space, then definitely 10 feet at a minimum.
Yeah, I mean, even at places like Occidental Arts and Ecology Center and the Lane Ingham's farm, there were still big areas where you could see it's like, ooh, this is a fire danger. They didn't clear those fire ladders. So it's important to do that.
Exactly.
We've got a comment from Johan, who said he examined several high-end mansions in Fountain Grove. Walking through the debris, it was clear that these houses had stucco exteriors and cement tile roofs, but these houses were completely gone. And so he said the wood framing, that everything had disappeared in smoke, no ashes. So he concludes that at least in the hot fire that you've described, Erik, the stucco and non-flammable roof wouldn't have saved those houses. So he says, no matter what kind of wood-framed house we have, we still need land management strategies. Yeah.
Yep. That's that. We're learning, right? I mean, I'm learning just here. It's a circular conversation. So that's really good assessment, Johan. And let's keep teaching each other as we keep reading. This is an unprecedented opportunity for those of us that live in these fire zone. Now that the fire is here, is to really observe and read the pattern so that we can grow in the right way from here.
On that same note, I would highly recommend Nader Khalili's book on ceramic houses. I don't know if you've seen that, Erik, but it's fascinating stuff.
I haven't seen it.
You need to read that book, because this is traditional Persian stuff where they would build houses functionally out of adobe, right? It was mostly clay with some sand and some filler. But they also had a ton of oil that was just like bubbling out of the ground when they were building these, and they would fire their houses like a giant kiln and turn them into these ceramic monoliths.
Oh my gosh.
Okay. If you can imagine setting your entire house on fire with coating it with oil, pouring oil into it, and then lighting it on fire to turn your house into a giant piece of pottery art. That's what they did, and that stuff was fireproof.
Well, exactly. No, that makes so much sense. As I've gone through some of these burned out areas, the things that are left are, you know, Kuan Yin statues and ceramic sculptures are left in the middle of all this destruction. And these things, well, they were already put in a kiln, so they can survive this. Well, and interestingly enough, I haven't read that book, but when I was doing a site visit on a burn area the other day, there were some folks there who are building ceramic domes, and they were consulting with the landowner and showing us this this material of this ceramic dome, and you know, essentially talking about a similar, more modern implementation of that, which I think makes absolute sense, especially for that landowner. We know the fire's going to come back, so anything he builds better be fireproof.
Yep. Plus, it's clay. It's a natural house.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyhow, I highly recommend that book. It was one of the things we were looking at doing in Saudi Arabia before I knew that we didn't have any clay in our soil.
Oh, bummer. Eric, I want
very bummed about it.
I wanted to ask you real quick, did you ever go to Harbin Hot Springs before it burned down, and did you kind of see some of those fire, you know, risks?
I didn't go, oh, before it burned.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've hiked back there. Yeah. You know, one thing that I didn't mention that, and I don't know if, you know, I don't want to pick on Harbin. I don't know if they're in this realm, but one piece that I didn't mention in the presentation is that in the environmental movement actually has had a negative impact on our management regime in the wildlands, because there was this, you know, in the 1970s, this environmental movement, you know, take all the animals off the land, don't touch the land, you know, no chainsaws, no cutting trees, you know, everything should be left alone.
We need to remove the keystone species.
What's that?
I said we need to get rid of the keystone species.
Right, right, yeah, exactly. So that has actually resulted in this situation where, you know, all these lands just had no management, because it's like no, the thing to do is to just leave it and not touch it, and that's leaving nature to be nature. But in fact, it actually exacerbated the problem, allowed fuel load to increase. And someone told us a story just the other night. It was a really interesting story about up in Mendocino County. They were, I think it was like the sand cranes. There's like an endangered species, and on these public lands, there was the environmentalists decided that we had to pull the cattle off the land in order to allow this endangered species to thrive. So it had been managed by cattle for a long time. So they pulled the cattle off the land, and then all these endangered cranes disappeared, and they were wondering where they went. And then they noticed on the neighbor's land that they were thriving. Of course, he was a cattle grazer. And so they went and asked him, so why are these endangered birds thriving here and not on the public lands? And he said, oh, they follow the cattle. That's their pattern. So it was like, you know, we're you know, trying to do good, but not using that ecological lens of actually reading the relationships of animals and ecologies, and then having that, allowing management to be, you know, allowing ourselves to be part of the management regime of the wild.
Yeah, that's great. And another thing, like defensible space, I remember the two examples I seen. Yeah, Harbin, before it went burnt down, it was totally beautiful, but they had trees interwoven to all the buildings connected to the forest, and there was no separation between the building and those trees. So if anything happened, all those buildings were going to go up at a time. Meanwhile, in a place I stayed at called Sage Mountain Center, Montana, it was beautiful straw bale cordwood houses, but they had at least, you know, 80 feet of defensible space, and they knew that they were in a wildfire area, so they prepared for it, and they've been able to survive through 2 mega fires that have gone through that area.
Wow.
So it's good to be prepared.
There's a really good question from David Haight here. He says, are you hearing any planning to create new reservoirs or water harvesting systems to provide firefighting water capacity and or secondary disaster flood control? And I would add to reestablish some functioning hydrology.
Right. At this point, no, there's no planning for that. The whole in this county, creating a reservoir is still a highly bureaucratic process, and you have a lot of folks who want to create reservoirs and ponds who've been on the waiting list for years. What's that? Can you hear me?
Keep going. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that hasn't been a discussion as of yet, but I think it's something that can come in. I mean, currently, you know, everyone should just know it's still a state of emergency for people on the ground here with trying to mitigate the toxic ash from flowing into the waterways. And one estimate was that we need 4 million lineal feet of wattles to protect our waterways from the ash flow. So right now, it's all hands on deck for that. And then what's going to happen is, as the rains come and go, all of the really big official, like EPA and FEMA and Army Corps of Engineers and CAL FIRE, they're going to pull out at some point. Right now, they're cleaning up. They're going to pull out, and then all of us locals are going to be left to continue. And so we're going to be the long-term solution, and that's when we can start talking more about how water plays its role in all of this. I mean, I like to make the connection between all of this fuel load that would, you know, hopefully bear and other animals could smash into the ground, and that's all carbon. And the point that was made last night, that you've got thousands and thousands and thousands of yards of wood chips from clearing along the roads, all the burned trees, that's going out of town. But you know, if we can keep all that biomass here on site and help build soil and sequester carbon, then the water holding capacity of the soil will be greater. The health of the, you know, plants and trees that are growing up will be better. So I think that's kind of like the first thing is redirect nutrient flows and carbon flows, protect waterways, and then we can start thinking about some the next level and the next planning phases. And one thing that I will say that everybody's been talking about is that even though when I think about trying to do a reservoir, you know, all the red flags about like going through the permitting process and all the bureaucratic stuff that comes up, the politics are just nauseating. But what's been really great is that things are happening on a day-to-day basis right now that would normally take weeks or months to get approval, and government agencies are like signing off on things like within a few hours notice. Like, we're going to put mushrooms in the wattles. Like, that would, years ago, that would have been frowned upon. It would have been, you would have had to have all kinds of studies. You know, it would not have been something that would be possible. But now it's like, we're in crisis mode. They're like, go, yeah, go. Anything that helps, do it. So it's been pretty cool to see the interagency collaboration and the moving through red tape as quickly as possible to get some of these cutting edge solutions on the ground.
Yeah, damn sure. I mean, this is a good moment to learn from Spain, California, Portugal, Pacific Northwest, BC, like anywhere that's dealing with fire. It's everywhere. Yeah, Australia is definitely just asked about that. Yeah, this is a huge learning opportunity to see what works and you know, be able to replicate it in different areas.
Well, Eric, I hope you get a chance to record what you're doing. And to write it down, and hopefully that a lot more folks can learn from what you're trying to do out there. There's so many lessons to be learned from this, and both in terms of prevention and management, and in terms of recovery, and the community side of it and the politics side of it. Like, it's all in this kind of Gordian knot, right? It's all one thing if you stand back enough. But getting into the details and talking about how all these different things are managed, it's crucial stuff. It's crucial stuff. So I want to thank you for coming on. We're approaching the 90-minute mark. If anyone else who's here live has a question or a comment or something to say to Eric, now's your chance before we hang up. You've got a lot of thanks on here, Eric. I don't know if you can see the comments.
I'm just starting to look at them. Yeah.
Yeah, go for it.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's been such great timing to have this conversation. I'm still learning a ton. The fire is teaching us every single day, and whether there are definitely some great. The community is absolutely incredible. We couldn't have better people managing the recovery and documenting this and pushing the edges of the ecological consciousness. And
Yeah.
so I think there's a lot to learn. We're going to document. We're going to share. I hope to come back here and share an update with y'all once we're out of the kind of urgent time and share everything we've learned, because we want to spread it to communities all over the world. What we learned through this experience, because this is going to happen again. It's going to happen if it's not your community, it's going to be, down the road. So yeah, thanks so much for having me on, and thanks everybody for tuning in, asking your great questions, and just having an awareness of what it is to live in these fire ecologies.
There we
Yeah,
go.
thanks everybody. Oh, and Carl said he sent a bunch of links in the chat box, so stick around an extra minute about some great resources about fire prevention from
Carl.
Yeah, from Carl from like Fire Ecology. Yeah, a lot of good stuff. And thank you so much, Eric. Man, I appreciate your time. You've done so much in the 2 weeks, and man, Sonoma, thousands of people should be thanking you right now, because you're making a serious impact in people's lives. And thank you for stepping up in the time of disasters, because people need your wisdom and they want it. And and thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for doing what you're doing.
There we go.
And everyone's going to get the replay. You're going to get links to some of the video that Eric made. A link to his ebook he wrote for children. That'll be fun to read. And also, there's a story I'm going to attach in the email about 2 ranchers who are part of the Sustainable Design Masterclass that had their large parts of their ranches burned down. Cal Veroni and Aaron Lusich. So you can read about that, and if you want to help donate to their recovery funds, you can do that as well. And Eric, if there's any other links about how we can help you in your micro-remediation effort, yeah, please send that our way, and we'll send it out to the folks here.
Okay, yeah, we'll do.
Thanks, folks. Remember, you're not alone. There's lessons that we can all learn from when a fire hit in your region. Doesn't matter if you're in Italy, Spain, Portugal, California, Oregon, Colorado. We can all learn from each other here in this moment.
All right, thanks everybody. We're going to cut the recording now.
Okay, recording is